All right, so welcome to the deep dive, everybody. Today we're going to be looking at something that's pretty fundamental to all of us, I think.
Yeah.
Something you probably use every single day, and that's money.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
And based on the stuff that you sent over, we're going to be going way back in time to kind of see how money has evolved.
Right.
And just looking through this stuff, it's crazy how many twists and turns. There are some really surprising and even some kind of ridiculous moments in the history of money.
It really is amazing, like the sheer variety of things that humans have decided to use to represent value.
Yeah.
It makes you think, what are the basic things that make our economies actually work?
Absolutely. And I think a good place to start is with bartering, right? Like
Yeah.
that's the most basic form of exchange.
Sure.
So let's say I've got a pile of fish and you've got some bread.
Yeah.
Seems simple enough, right? You trade the fish for the bread, but like, what if you just don't want fish that day? Or what if I'm the baker and I'm really holding out for like a goat in exchange for my loaf of bread?
Yeah,
Then it becomes this whole negotiation and it gets really complicated.
exactly.
And some of the sources we looked at really illustrated this well, like just picturing people back in the day standing there trying to figure out if like 5 fish were actually worth a loaf of bread.
Yeah.
Someone else was offering a chicken. And it's just this whole...
Well, like, how do you even decide, right?
Yeah.
Like, what is it worth to you versus me? And, like, how do we agree on that?
Exactly. And that's what's so interesting. It's like
Yeah.
that need for something more standardized, I guess you could say, something that was like universally accepted.
Right. You need a way to do this exchange where everybody trusts that what they're getting is worth something,
Yeah.
that it's going to last,
Mhm.
that they can carry it around easily,
Yeah.
and that they can divide it up into smaller portions.
Mm-hmm.
And those are all things that bartering just couldn't do very well.
Yeah. Right. And that's where I think things start to get really interesting because people started using all sorts of different objects as like their go-to currency, right? So we're
Yeah.
talking about things like seashells or even salt.
Salt, yeah.
And it's crazy to think that like salt was so valuable at one point in time that it actually gave us the word salary.
Oh, wow.
Like that comes from the Latin word for salt.
Interesting.
But the example that really kind of stood out to me from the things you sent over was the currency they used on Yap Island.
Oh, yeah, those huge stone discs, those
Yeah.
ray stones.
Yeah.
What's so fascinating about them is just the fact that they're so big and that they often didn't even move when ownership changed hands.
I know, it's amazing.
Like, you can imagine these things are huge. Some of them weigh tons.
Yeah.
And it just shows that it wasn't really about, like, physically having the object
Right.
to say that you owned it.
Yeah, it was more about like,
It was the community's understanding and their agreement.
yeah, like a shared history almost.
Exactly.
It was almost like, they talked about how in the material that like ownership could change hands without the stone even moving.
Right.
It was all about the history of that stone and knowing who owned it.
It was all agreed upon.
Yeah.
And that's what made it work.
Can you imagine trying to steal one of those things in the middle of the night?
I mean, good luck.
Yeah.
But that's what's so interesting about money.
Yeah.
It really is a social construct.
Mm-hmm.
It only works because we all agree that it have value
Right.
and we're willing to accept it for payment.
Exactly. And I think the Yap stones are a great example of that because, like,
Yeah.
even though they weren't really practical for everyday use,
Right.
the fact that everyone in that community agreed on their value made it work.
It made it a functional monetary system.
Yeah, it's so cool.
Yeah.
So we've talked about bartering, which is like logistically a nightmare, and then these early forms of like commodity money,
Right.
seashells, salt, Yap stones, but those
Yeah.
have their own limitations too.
Yeah, for sure.
I mean, you can only carry around so much salt,
Right.
and good luck fitting a Yap stone in your wallet.
Exactly.
So what was like the next big step in the evolution of money?
Well, that's where we get to precious metals, like gold and silver and the invention of coins.
Oh, yeah.
The sources you provided point to the Lydians around 600 BC as being the first to make standardized coins out of metal.
Yeah, and that makes a lot of sense, right?
Yeah.
Because gold and silver are rare, they don't rust,
Exactly.
and they're much easier to carry around than bags of salt or giant stone discs.
Right. Plus, you can divide them up easily. You
Yeah.
can melt them down and make smaller coins.
Yeah, it's so much more efficient both for like trading and for storing wealth.
Exactly.
But even then, this period of time wasn't without its own little, I guess you could say, innovative approaches to finance.
No. Oh, yeah. What are you thinking of?
I'm thinking about the ruler trick.
Oh, yeah, that's a good one.
That was so funny to read about.
Yeah, so the Lydian rulers and some others who came after them,
Yeah.
they figured out that they could shave off tiny bits of gold or silver from the edges of their coins before putting them into circulation.
Yeah, like the coin still looked pretty much the same,
Right.
but the ruler was secretly collecting all these little shavings of precious metal.
It's sneaky but clever.
Yeah, and what I thought was so interesting about that is that it's kind of this early example of like
Right.
the tension between, trust and who's in charge of the money and the actual value of the money itself.
Right, because you could argue that this was one of the first times that a government was manipulating the value of money for their own benefit.
It's kind of like a government money hack.
Yeah, and it's happening over 2,500 years ago.
Yeah, you'd think we'd have learned from that by now.
You would think so.
But I guess the thing is, even carrying around a bunch of gold and silver coins, especially for large transactions, probably wasn't ideal.
No, it wasn't.
Well,
So what happened next?
that leads us to the invention of paper money.
Oh, yeah.
Your sources are right that this started in 7th century China.
And they were facing the same problem, right? It's hard to carry around huge amounts of metal for trade.
Right.
So they came up with the idea of using paper notes to represent value instead.
And in a way, that's really smart, right?
It is.
It's lightweight, it's easy to carry around,
Yeah.
but then it also raises the question of, like, confidence and security.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Because if it's just a piece of paper, what's to stop anyone from just printing their own?
Well, that's exactly why the Chinese government came down so hard on counterfeiting.
Okay.
The sources you shared mentioned that the punishment was death.
Wow.
That shows you how serious they were about making sure people trusted this new form of money.
Yeah, if people didn't believe that the paper was actually worth something,
Right.
the whole system would have collapsed.
Exactly.
So that's a pretty good incentive not to print your own money.
Yeah, I'd say so.
But it's interesting, though, that Europe was so slow to adopt paper money. Like, if you have Marco Polo coming back from China in the 13th century talking about this paper money, and it still takes Europe centuries to catch on.
I know in Europe, there was this really strong tradition of money being linked to precious metals.
Right.
So this idea that a piece of paper could represent value without actually being made of gold or silver was really hard for a lot of people to accept.
Yeah, they just didn't trust it.
Yeah, it took a long time for the convenience of paper money to win them over.
Yeah, but eventually it did.
It did, and by the 1800s, paper money was pretty much accepted all over the world.
Which brings us to, I guess, what you could call like a really big turning point in the history of money.
Okay.
And that's when that link to physical assets that we've been talking about, the gold standard,
Right.
that started to weaken and then eventually disappear.
Right.
And your sources highlighted 1971 as like the key year when the U.S. government ended the direct link between the dollar and gold.
That was a huge moment.
Yeah.
Because for so long, even though paper money wasn't actually gold or silver,
Yeah.
it was still based on the idea that you could exchange it for a certain amount of those metals.
Right.
But when that guarantee went away, the value of money became based mostly on faith.
Right.
Faith in the government and the economy.
So basically, like the source material said, money became fake in a sense.
yeah.
Not that it's worthless,
Right.
but that it's not tied to something tangible like gold anymore.
It's more like a collective agreement.
Yeah.
Like we all believe in these numbers on a screen that are controlled by banks and governments.
It's pretty wild when you think about it.
It really is.
And that brings us to today, where we're using less and less physical cash.
Right.
It's all about tapping cards and phone apps and transferring money digitally.
Yeah.
And then, of course, there's the whole world of cryptocurrency.
Oh, yeah. That's a whole other thing.
I mean, digital transactions seem like a natural progression from paper money, right?
They do.
It's just taking that convenience to the next level.
Yeah. You can send money anywhere in the world instantly without needing physical cash.
And Bitcoin, which came out in 2009,
Right.
that's a really interesting development in the digital world.
That is.
Because it's this decentralized currency that's not controlled by any government or central bank.
Which is a big change from the way we've always thought about money.
Absolutely.
I mean, cryptocurrency introduces a totally different model for how we create, store, and exchange value.
Yeah, and the sources you sent over really captured like the different sides of this.
Right.
Like there's this huge optimism about its potential to revolutionize finance, but then there's also this concern about how volatile it is.
Right. And the risk of like these speculative bubbles forming.
It feels like we're in this kind of Wild West phase with crypto.
I think that's a good way to put it.
Yeah, it has so much potential, but there are also so many risks.
Definitely.
But it's crazy to think about how fast things have changed in the last century. Like, we went from the gold standard to purely fiat currency and now to digital currencies. Like, it's mind-blowing.
I know, especially compared to how slow things moved for thousands of years before that.
Yeah, it's incredible.
It really shows you how the evolution of money is tied to the evolution of our societies, our technology, and our ideas about what's valuable.
And so after taking this deep dive into the history of money,
Right.
it really leaves you with a lot to think about. Like, is the way we use money today really better than the systems of the past?
It's a good question.
Was holding actual gold like the best way to do things?
Who knows?
And with the rise of digital currencies and all these debates about the role of governments in our finances,
Right.
what's money even going to look like in 100 years?
It's hard to say.
It's a story that's definitely still being written.
For sure.
So much to think about.
Yeah.
So fascinating.
That's